All right, those of you who are slowly entering this evening's virtual happy hour, thanks for joining us. As always, welcome to your tap room, your tavern, where we try to keep this idea of community going, even though we are in these goofy times. If you have a question, please ask it in the chat room and we'll get to it at the end of the conversation. For those of you on Facebook, welcome as well. And please go ahead and ask any questions in that comments area below. And we will also include your questions, any questions that you may have when we get to that Q&A part of it all. Lucas, who is on here, who is on our board and is our official, or maybe I should say unofficial, Zoom master guru. I just want to point out that he's drinking our newest Bruseum beer, the Nova Repair Tub, made by Sketchbook Brewing out of Evanston and Skokie, and in collaboration with the Newberry Library. If you guys have a chance to go grab some of that, I suggest you go to the tap rooms, either one, and get it because it's very limited. Each can, there are 6 cans, and each can features a different print. So it's actually kind of a collector's item, if you will. So grab that. Yeah, so I'm gonna get the show on the road because I know that your time is valuable, Kathleen, and I appreciate that. So I'm particularly excited about tonight's conversation. The Bruseum is often dedicated to making sure that beer history and culture are always relevant. And amazingly, beer history and culture are always relevant. You can often make the connection to alcohol in some way, shape, or form, and in ways sometimes we don't even think about. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, but the connection is certainly there. And so we were very dedicated to making sure that we have our minds on the election and asking people to go vote. Coming up November 3rd or before, do some early voting. And so the topics that we've been discussing this month have really focused around some of those issues of voting and the election. Tonight we're talking about women of color who transformed the suffrage movement with Dr. Cathleen Cahill. You know, the Chicago geek in all of us sort of gets excited when anyone has some sort of connection to Chicago. And so Dr. Cahill received her PhD from the University of Chicago in 2004. I'm sure you have some happy memories of your time here. She's currently an associate professor of history at Penn State University and author of the upcoming Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement. And her first book, Federal Fathers and Mothers, A Social History of the United States Indian Service, 1869 to 1933, won the Labriola Center for American Indian National Book Award and was a finalist for the David J. Weber and Bill Clements Book Prize. She's also steering committee chair for the Coalition for Western Women's History. So Kathleen, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule. I know teaching can't be easy right now. And sharing insight on a very important topic, a very relevant topic, and certainly being here for the Bruseum.
Great, thank you, Liz, for that introduction. And I am really excited to be here tonight. I misjudged. I thought it'd be unprofessional to have a beer, but I will have one right afterwards. And I did. I loved living in Chicago. I miss it dearly. It was a great city. I had a great time. I lived there for about a decade. And so I'm really excited to be talking to you guys tonight. As Liz said, this is for my forthcoming book, Recasting the Vote. It's actually on its way to me right now, so you can order it through your local bookstore or other online purveyors of books, and it will be on its way soon. I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share here. And so most of what I'm going to talk about is, again, the experience of women of color, which I think is and suffrage, which is quite relevant to our contemporary debates about the vote, and the fact that we have the first woman of color, Kamala Harris, running on a major political party's presidential platform. She's running it for vice president. And this is sort of the story of kind of legacy that would, I think, look familiar to her. I'll try to weave in sort of some of things about alcohol and beer as I go, and I'm happy to answer questions about that a little bit in our question and answer session. So I wanted to start with this. I did a Google image search for suffragist, and this is what comes up. And I think that this is sort of generally a good example of what most people think of if they hear the term suffragist, right? You might know a couple of the famous leaders. You think of women, you know, marching with signs, wearing dresses, white dresses. And that's certainly, right, what Google's showing us here. It's not fully representative of kind of the whole world, but it's a good example. Now, there were, in these photos, there are no women of color. These are all white women in these pictures. And there certainly were large numbers of white women in the movement, but what we miss is a sense of what happens if we think about the broader diversity among suffragists. And especially if we think even beyond a black-white dichotomy, that it wasn't just Black women who were part of the movement, there were also other groups of women of color. And so what I think I'm going to do today are think about 3 key moments in the suffrage movement that are pretty famous in terms of suffrage historians would know about them, and you might have heard of them, documentaries hit on them. And then I'm going to look at them from slightly different angles and look at what happens when we include the stories of women of color in those different moments. And before I get started, I'd like to point out, right, this is a moment in terms of constitutional change, this progressive era, where there were multiple amendments that happened, right, that were made part of the Constitution. The 16th Amendment with federal income tax, the 17th, which was the direct election of senators, and of course you were probably most familiar with the 18th Amendment or prohibition, right? The 19th then is part of that cluster that all happen within a few years of each other. So again, thinking about women of color in the movement does a couple of things. First, it expands our knowledge of the many communities who were having suffrage conversations, and it expands our understanding of how those conversations influenced each other. Secondly, it encourages us to think about women of color as not just an undifferentiated group, but a group that had some things in common, but also major differences. And finally, this project adds new suffrage stories to our narrative, but it isn't just additive, right? It's not just more. I would say it actually changes our understanding of the different debates because the contribution and presence of women of color influence national and international dialogue in ways that historians have often overlooked. So incorporating these women's stories forces us to reconsider old turning points and add new ones. And in particular, we need to ask if 1920 and the ratification of the 19th Amendment held the same importance for all women. So as I said, I'm going to talk about 3 moments, and the first moment is a suffrage parade in New York in 1912. The second is a suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913. And then the third moment is 1920 and the ratification of the amendment. But let me give you some really quick introductions to some of the women I'm going to talk about. There we go. So in 1901, 5-year-old Mabel Ping-Hua Lee sailed from China with her mother. They arrived in San Francisco, where they were greeted by her father, Li Tao, who was a Baptist minister. And although Chinese immigration to the US had been severely restricted by the Chinese Exclusion Act since 1882, most Chinese people could not immigrate. Mabel's mother was a teacher and therefore admitted under one of the very few exceptions to that act. But that act also said that any Chinese who did immigrate to the United States could not become naturalized citizens. Right? So it was the only country in the world where its people could not become naturalized citizens. The second woman, Louise Bottineau Baldwin, was proud of her French and Ojibwe heritages. She moved from Minnesota, from Minneapolis, to Washington, D.C. around 1890. She had moved to work as a legal clerk for her father, Jean-Baptiste Bottineau, who was the attorney for the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Nation in what is now North Dakota. And the nation was contesting a treaty that the United States had signed with them in 1882, insisting that their land was worth much more than the 10 cents an acre that the government wanted to pay them for it. And they sent Bottineau to fight for them. And he brought Marie to work as his clerk. The third woman, who you'll see is a Chicagoan, is Ida B. Wells, and she was no stranger to life's challenges. Her parents and her youngest brother had died of yellow fever within a day of each other, leaving 16-year-old Ida to raise her 5 remaining living siblings. She worked as a teacher and rode 5 miles to school every morning. And later she moved to Memphis to take a job, teaching job there. And in that city, she also began to write for a local African-American newspaper. In 1892, she printed a scathing critique of lynching and implicated her white Memphis neighbors for supporting it. And she described the reaction to this editorial from those neighbors. Quote, "I had a price put on my head and had been made an exile from home for hinting at the truth," end quote. And she leaves Tennessee and moves to Chicago, Illinois. And we'll come back to her. This is Adelina Isabella Amelia Luna Otero-Warren, or Nina, who was the daughter of 2 very influential Hispanic families in New Mexico. During her lifetime, the Anglo population of New Mexico Territory had dramatically increased, but Spanish speakers still held a great deal of political power. And the men in her family were quite powerful politicians, especially her cousin, Miguel Otero, who was appointed territorial governor in 1897 by William McKinley. And although her sex kept her from these political heights, she was very interested in them. So let me give you just a little bit of the bigger context at the turn of the century. Suffrage leaders had been following a strategy of trying to gain women's suffrage at the state level, so working through state legislatures. And they've been really quite successful, you can see here, particularly in the Western states. Before 1914, only New Mexico was the only sort of Intermountain/West Coast state that had not granted women full suffrage rights. So white is full suffrage, gray is partial, black is no women's suffrage at all. And so you can see Illinois over there has partial, again in 1913, I'll also mention that. But so this state-by-state strategy is going to come back to us and be important, but before I talk about that, I just want to share this slide in honor of the Bruseum. This is actually from a Pennsylvania state campaign in 1915, and you can see that generally most suffragists were also prohibitionists, and most anti-suffragists were anti-suffrage, or many anti-suffragists were folks who were liquor salesmen, right? The liquor interest was seen as a big anti-suffrage group, and these two are pro-suffrage. The suffragists of Pennsylvania were passing them out during that election, and we can talk about them more later if you'd like to. So the first moment I want to talk about is this New York City parade. And New York State had one of the largest congressional delegations in the country. And so suffrage leaders hoped that if they won suffrage there, that would get them even closer to having a pro-suffrage majority in Congress. And in May of 1912, they were planning a massive parade to publicize their cause. And at the same time, events were happening in China that many suffragists in the United States were watching. Now, I cannot go into the details of the Chinese Revolution because it's really complex, but broadly, Sun Yat-sen's vision for a Republican China, in that he emphasized women's equality and women took part in the cause. And newspapers in the United States carried all kinds of stories about women's role in the revolution, that they served as spies, that they carried bombs, that they fought. And these Chinese Joans of Arc, as they called them, fascinated Americans. And in fact, as you can see here, after the revolution was successful, news flew to the US that the Chinese Republic had enfranchised women. Now, this is not the communist China, that's later, this is the Republic of China. So many US suffrage supporters said that they were, quote, glad but irritated too by the news. They grumbled that it was, quote, a discredit to the men of the United States that China had enfranchised women before the US. And it's important to remember that most Americans held China and Chinese people in low regard, right? They're the only group of people who are seen as too foreign to be allowed to immigrate to the US and too foreign to become citizens, right? So all of these stereotypes about the Chinese meant that Americans were pretty surprised and kind of befuddled when China seems to have enfranchised its women. So stories about these female revolutionaries and newly enfranchised women in China prompted American reporters to do some digging in their own backyards. And the Chinese women in the US were happy to give them their stories. And they used this unexpected interest in the Chinese Revolution to suggest that maybe Americans had the wrong idea about the Chinese nation and its people, as well as about the Chinese in the United States. And so this, I didn't have a picture of Chicago, but this is Cincinnati, Ohio, a woman in Cincinnati, Ohio. In New York, papers reported that national suffrage leaders held a meeting with a group of Chinese suffragists, and they're on the left there. The white suffragists included the major leaders of the movement. The woman at the podium is Anna Howard Shaw, who was the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is the biggest national group. And they wanted to use this this meeting and this news about Chinese women to pressure American men to grant US women's suffrage. And they knew that they would get press coverage by being at this meeting. The Chinese women included Pearl Mark Liu on the left with the kids, and Lai Beck Lee, who's sitting on the right, and her daughter Mabel Lee, who's at her shoulder. And they had a great deal to say. And this interest gives them a platform, right? An opportunity to address some of the most powerful women in the city and frankly in the nation. So they're a really well-educated group of women. They all have ties to missionary movements in China. And in fact, the two older women had worked at the Graves Missionary Station in Canton. And they had emigrated with the help of missionaries, but because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, they are ineligible to become citizens. And you see this here in the census where they're listed as aliens. They're also suffragists, and their activism focused on the problems that face their community. So in New York, this includes the harsh immigration laws, the lack of educational opportunities for Chinese girls and Chinese boys in the public schools, and the prejudice that they face in the US. And they also stayed in touch with the women's movement in China. And this is what they talk about when they speak to this, this larger audience. Now, Mabel Lee, the woman I'm going to focus on, she was very young. She's only 16. She's a high school student when she gives this talk, but she's impressive. She had already been accepted to Barnard College and would start there in the fall. She was also quite a speaker and impressed the crowd. Later, reporters used to describe her as having Mabelized her audiences. And she really talks a lot about the lack of schools and parks for Chinese children in New York. And she said that this is especially hard on the girls. Quote, "All women are recognized in New York, excepting Chinese women. She is not included in your educational institutions. Your social and recreational centers do not include her. How can she learn? How can you have half of your people in utter darkness and the other half in light?" And she's really proud that her country had enfranchised women, but she lived in New York, and she hoped that New Yorkers would recognize the importance of equality, both gender equality and racial equality. So she really impresses the suffrage leaders, and they actually invite her to participate in that upcoming parade that they're planning. And they actually do more than just invite her to participate. They actually, oh, here she is. Sorry, I forgot to forward to that one. There she is speaking. They ask her to ride with the honor guard that's going to open the parade. This is 50 mounted women who will sort of lead the parade up Fifth Avenue. And most of the other riders are sort of the daughters of wealthy New Yorkers and kind of famous suffragists and this sort of thing. But she's one of the most anticipated riders. And newspapers around the country publish her picture and write stories about her and sort of just anticipate her in the parade. The other women from Chinatown, including her mother, also march in a different section of the parade, and they carry the flag of the new Chinese Republic and banners that say things like "Light from China." And they're very aware of how Americans talk about them as, quote, benighted heathens or a backwards country. And so they're sort of throwing those words back at Americans. Now, nothing in this parade is left to chance. Suffragists are incredibly good at choreographing and PR. And so deliberately positioned directly behind the women from Chinatown was Anna Howard Shaw, who you recall was the president of the major national organization. And she's holding this banner, Nassau catching up with China. So on one hand, this kind of seems complimentary to China, but it also challenges New Yorkers to write this unusual role in which China is ahead of the United States or more enlightened than the United States. And so I want to also point out that this sort of treatment of the Chinese, the way in which newspapers are writing about them and talking about them individually, stands in really sharp contrast to their reporting on African American marchers. In New York, Black men could vote, and white suffrage leaders know that they need to make overtures to Black women and in order to win their community's support. And African American women do march, and they also deploy symbolism. So for example, suffrage organizers had asked everyone in the parade to wear a white dress to stand out and to look uniform. Black women actually wear black dresses with yellow sashes, right? So they reverse this and are part of a group themselves. Reporters treat them very differently. They don't name them, they barely talk about them. Only a few papers mention them, in contrast to the Chinese women who get all kinds of national press. So over the next few months, mainstream suffragists kept the spotlight on Chinese women. This is a big story for all of 1912. Anna Howard Shaw goes on a speaking tour with her banner that summer, and she's, again, using the same kinds of arguments. In September, Carrie Chapman Catt, who at the time was the president of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, visited China as part of this world tour. And in Canton, she visited the Guangdong Provincial Assembly, and she looked down as she watched, as she put it in an article, quote, China's 10 women legislators who had been called a myth, right? It was, she wrote, the most wonderful day of her life up to that point. So she meets these women who are actually serving in office in China. So unfortunately, the Chinese Revolution descends into civil war, and the different factions are struggling for power. And the faction that supported women's rights, which is Sun Yat-sen and the allies in the South, in Canton, lose the upper hand. And so the story of suffrage in China is going to take a lot longer to come to fulfillment. But in the United States, Chinese women continue to follow those events. And white suffragists continue to sort of check in on them every once in a while, but generally they moved on to other things. So Mabel Lee enrolls at Barnard, as I said, and she continues these conversations with suffrage leaders. And she's sort of someone they often call as their expert on China to come speak for them. But her career after 1912 also really demonstrates the transnational conversations in her political activism. So at Barnard, she joins the Chinese Students Alliance. And the Chinese Student Alliance was made up primarily of male students from China who were basically exchange students who were allowed to come to the country for the 4 years to go to college, and then they were going back, and it was known they'd be the sort of business and political leaders of this new nation. And this was a national policy that sort of the US was hoping to create these political ties. So there's a group of these students, and Mabel uses that organization to continue advocating for women's rights and urging these students to incorporate women's rights into their new nation once they return to become these political and economic leaders. And you can see here she writes articles for the Chinese Students Monthly and is really talking to them. So 1917 is the year she graduates from Barnard, and that's an important year in New York. That's when New York women win suffrage at the state level. Now, Mabel could participate in the Chinese Student Alliance elections, and she does, but she cannot vote in New York as she is ineligible for citizenship. But she persists in living her feminism. So in this article, she wrote that voting was only one of the ways women could advance. And one of the other ways was in the professions. But Mabel wrote one of the other ways was in the professions. And she wrote, quote, "But this again is being refuted by the success of pioneers of today." So in other words, there are lots of places where women can be pioneers and women can make a difference, and voting is only one of them. So since she can't vote, she decides to go into in that direction. And so in 1918, she enrolls in the PhD program at Columbia. And in 1921, she earns her PhD in economics. And as far as I can tell, she's the first Chinese woman in the US to do that. So she had thought she was going to return to China and sort of help build that new nation. But her father's death in 1924 and the civil unrest in China changed her mind. So instead, she turns to helping her community in New York, and she takes over the administration of the first Chinese Baptist church in New York City, which her father had founded, and she holds that position until her death in 1966. And it's still there, it's still a functioning church. So Mabel Lee's story deserves to be known in its own right because she was a phenomenal woman who constantly strove to demonstrate that women could be equal to men, who challenged multiple limits, and who worked to help her community. But her participation in suffrage also throws open new vistas on a familiar story. We see that American suffragists were very interested in events in China and followed them closely. And that when Chinese women won the right to vote, it gave American women a new strategy, one they take full advantage of. It also opened this space for Chinese women in the US, giving them a large national audience to whom they could make their case for racial and gender equity. And finally, it reveals, again, this transnational nature of suffrage history, as she was interested in women's rights in both the US and China. So let me move on to the second moment, which again was the suffrage parade in 1913. So a little bit further south in Washington, DC, another woman was becoming an important first. As you recall, Louise Bottineau Baldwin had moved to the nation's capital to help fight for Turtle Mountain Chippewa Nation's treaty rights. And by 1904, Congress had settled the treaty on the original terms. And basically, long story short, it leads Marie and her father into a lawsuit in which their lawyer was none other than the famous Belva Lockwood. She is known as a former presidential candidate, one of the first women to run for president, and the first woman admitted to the bar of the Supreme Court. And meeting Lockwood opens up Marie's horizons, right? She sees a female lawyer in the courtroom, not just a law clerk, right? And Lockwood was also on the board of the Washington College of Law, which was a law school founded by feminists to train women lawyers who were rejected from most law schools in the country. And so just a few years after that trial, she enrolls here. And not surprisingly, this school is a hotbed of suffrage activism. Whoops. And I should note that while the founders of the Washington College of Law were very adamant about sex equality, they were less so about racial equality. They claimed to be the only law school for women and men in the city, but in fact, Howard University, a school that was founded during Reconstruction for African Americans and now known as Kamala Harris's alma mater, allowed women to enroll in its law school. And the founders knew this because one of them had taken classes there, right? But they refused to enroll African Americans in their own school. But as a Native woman, Marie Baldwin didn't face that same kind of discrimination, and she enrolls. She's also, at the same time, working at the Bureau of Indian Affairs and becoming very active in a group called the Society of American Indians. It was somewhat like the NAACP. It wanted to disabuse white Americans and Black Americans, to be fair, of their stereotypes about Native people. Particularly, they rejected the idea that Indians were primitive people who were incompatible with modernity and vanishing into the past. Like Baldwin, many of their members were very accomplished, especially by Western standards. And so her time at the law school and in the Society of American Indians really radicalizes her, and she becomes much more vocal about her position as a Native woman. She argued that Native cultures were valuable and should not be destroyed, which was, of course, the policy of her employer, the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the time. She advocated for women's rights and arguing that all women, but especially Native women, should get their law degrees. And she celebrated Native women's creativity by amassing a large art collection, which she later actually displays in the Department of the Interior. So let's step back just for a minute and remember that the suffrage movement had been using this state-by-state strategy. But by 1913, there's this growing idea that maybe they should pass a national amendment to the Constitution. And young Alice Paul, who's sort of a rising star in the movement, takes this up as her challenge. And she decides that the best way to announce this new strategy is to hold a parade in the nation's capital the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, right? And so she does. And as a result of Marie Baldwin's activism, suffrage leaders in DC invite her to participate in the parade by creating a float that would represent Native women and the power that they wielded in their traditional matriarchal societies. This is something that non-Native feminists are really interested in. And I'm going to show this cartoon. There's some language that's no longer acceptable, but it's a historical piece. So I'm going to put it up there. On the left, you see this kind of way in which Native women were romanticized. And then on the right is Marie Baldwin. So she doesn't ultimately organize the float. She chooses instead to march with her colleagues in the Washington College of Law. And she's the only Native person, as far as I can tell, who was in the parade. And once again, though, suffrage leaders, like the founders of the Washington College of Law, treated her differently from African Americans who also wanted to march in that parade. So Alice Paul was worried that she would lose the support of Southern women and Southern legislators if the parade were integrated. The idea of women's suffrage was really threatening to some of the Jim Crow laws and the white supremacist policies of the South. They were worried that Black women voting would challenge that. So Paul discourages African-American women from voting, and she tries to insist that if they're going to march, then they need to march in the back of the parade. But Black women refuse this. Both they refuse not to participate, and they refuse to be in the back of the parade. So I want to talk about Ida B. Wells, who I mentioned before. So remember, she'd moved to Chicago, and there she had helped found the first African-American women's suffrage organization in the state of Illinois. It's called the Alpha Suffrage Club. And she was chosen as one of the delegates to represent the state in the DC parade. And so when Illinois' delegates arrive in Washington, they hear about this pronouncement that Black women are supposed to march in the back, and they face a dilemma. Would they support a fellow delegate from Illinois, or would they insist that she march with the women of her own race in the back of the parade? And they hold a really intense meeting that the Chicago Tribune covers. Some of the delegates strongly support Ida B. Wells, and some of them don't. And they take a vote, and the majority of the white women basically ask her to march in the back of the parade. So the morning of the parade, they show up and get in place, and they don't see her anywhere, and they assume she's at the end. But partway through the parade, she steps in from out of the crowd. She steps into the parade with the Illinois delegation and sort of dares anyone to cause a scene by kicking her out. And she finishes the march with her state. And a few months later, Illinois passes partial women's suffrage. They can vote in some elections, including in Illinois. So Wells Barnett was thrilled by this, and she gets involved and helps elect Chicago's first Black alderman, Oscar Priest. But she was aware that women in her home state of Tennessee are still unable to vote at all, and their communities continue to be plagued by the violence of lynching. So that brings me to the third moment, which takes place in her home state. And in this third moment, I want to ask if 1920 and the ratification of the amendment held the same importance for all women. So 6 years later, in her home state of Tennessee, one of the most dramatic chapters of the struggle took place. By 1920, the strategy of passing a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage had made major headway. Congress had passed the amendment, had sent it out to the states for ratification. They needed, according to the Constitution, 3/4 of the 48 states to approve it to become an amendment. And by March, 35 states had ratified it, just one short of the quote unquote perfect 36 that they needed. So, but throughout the next few months, disappointment followed on disappointment as Southern states refused, either rejected it or refused to vote on it. And by August, it came down to Tennessee. And so both pro and anti-suffrage forces gather in Nashville. Carrie Chapman Catt, who's now the president of NASA, is there coordinating the campaign from her hotel room in the Hermitage Hotel. And she actually writes about how the anti-forces have like an open barrel of whiskey or bourbon probably on the 8th floor, and they're bribing legislators with this, right, despite prohibition. And it passes by a single vote in the state house. This was a really fierce fight. This had been decades-long fight, and it passes by one vote, right? And so it's a huge relief. And Catt returns in triumph to New York. And at a celebratory banquet, she triumphantly announces, "Now that we have the vote, let us remember we are no longer petitioners. We are not wards of the government, but free and equal citizens. Let us do our part to keep it a true and triumphant democracy." And she added, the victory is everybody's victory who had labored in the cause. But that wasn't quite true. And if we look at the state of New Mexico, we see how starkly different women's experiences were. Even though the amendment dramatically expanded the horizons of some women, it didn't do so equally. So in New Mexico, women win full suffrage with the passage of the amendment, and Nina Otero-Warren, who had been the point person for Alice Paul's National Women's Party, played a key role in getting it through the New Mexico state legislature. She also in New Mexico insisted that suffrage literature needed to be written in both Spanish and English, as the majority of the population spoke Spanish. So in response to her hard work, the Republican Party actually nominates her to run for Congress in 1922 on their ticket. And she's the first woman of color in the nation to run on a major ticket. And her campaign is covered across the country. Here you see it, an article there from, I think, Washington Post. And she's not the only Hispanic woman to run in New Mexico. Democrat Soledad Chavez de Chacon of Albuquerque ran for Secretary of State that same year. Now, Otero-Warren loses, but Soledad Chavez de Chacon wins and becomes the first Hispanic woman to win a statewide election in the nation and the first woman in the US to serve in that office. So unlike Hispanics and Anglo women who had both been enfranchised, Native women in New Mexico and the rest of the country were not included in the expansion of the franchise under the 19th Amendment. And in fact, the vast majority of Native people were not citizens at all, but legally categorized as wards of the government. The Society of American Indians, Marie Baldwin's group, had been pointing this out for some time and continued to make the case after 1920. And a colleague of hers in that organization, Gertrude Bonnin, or Zitkala-Ša, who's a woman of Santee, Dakota descent, she's very vocal about this after 1920. She's a famous author who used her fame to highlight the lack of civil rights. And she keeps going. So here's an article where she's speaking to the National Women's Party at a big conference they hold to kind of determine what should they do after, now that they've been successful. And she says, hey, you should help Native women and men who are still disenfranchised and are not even citizens. But of course, the National Women's Party decides that they're going to focus on an equal rights amendment, right? Another amendment. And so Gertrude Bonnin turns to another group of women called the General Federation of Women's Clubs. And she continues to fight, arguing, quote, wardship is no substitute for American citizenship, and therefore we seek the Indians' enfranchisement. And she's arguing in particular that Native men served in large numbers in World War I, and so they were fighting for a country that hadn't granted them citizenship, and that's a pretty effective argument as well. So in 1924, Congress passes the Indian Citizenship Act, which confers citizenship on Native people. And it's really important to note that not all Native people at the time wanted this. They said, you know, we're citizens in our own nations. but the government just sort of grants it blanket. Gertrude Bonnin, though, is really excited about this, and she founds another organization called the National Council of American Indians, and she and her husband, Army veteran Raymond Bonnin, travel many thousands of miles by car for the off-year election of 1926. They go from Washington, which is where they're living, around reservations in the West, and they explain the new Citizenship Act, and they help register Native voters. So this had passed too late for people to vote in 1924 in the presidential election, but in 1928, many Native people do vote, and the future probably seemed bright because Republican candidate Herbert Hoover and his vice presidential candidate Charles Curtis, who had been a senator, won the election. And Senator Curtis was Native American, or as he liked to put it, quote, "I'm 1/8 Kaw Indian and 100% Republican." And this is a widely known fact. He's one of several Native men in Congress, actually. And the National Women's Party endorses the Republican ticket because they have a close relationship with him. And in fact, he is the senator who introduces the ERA into the Senate for the first time. For the first time Congress votes on it. So obviously the Native vote wasn't necessarily decisive in that election and in Hoover's win, but it probably helped in some states. And the non-Native population of those states was concerned that there might be an Indian bloc or an Indian vote in places like Oklahoma, Montana, Arizona, New Mexico, the Dakotas, where there's a large Native population. And many of those states moved to take those rights away just as they were gained. In New Mexico and Arizona in 1924, court cases disenfranchised Native people who lived on reservations, which was basically all of them. In Montana, after 1928, the state dropped everybody from the voting rolls, said you needed to re-register, but moved registration offices far away from reservations. So all kinds of shenanigans to disenfranchise Native people, some of which looked a lot like Jim Crow laws, some of which were more specific to Native people's relationship to reservations in the federal government. So Gertrude Bonnin was outraged, and she said, quote, "If our vice presidential-elect, Honorable Charles Curtis, an Indian, had lived as a member of a tribe on a reservation, he would be disenfranchised. He could not vote, much less run for the vice presidency of the United States." But most of these laws stand until post-World War II, and particularly until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and its amendments. So to conclude, whoa, I'm way behind, sorry. There's Charles Curtis, there's Gertrude Bonnin. Let's just end. 1920 was an incredible moment, and the electorate expanded dramatically as newly enfranchised women now had the right to vote. But the different experiences of the women I've talked about, particularly here, the Hispanic and Native women in the same state, show us that 1920 didn't mean the same thing for all women. Chinese women who had immigrated to the United States but were barred from becoming legal citizens, Native women who lived on reservations, they couldn't celebrate the victory, even as some of them had helped fight for it. And it would take more than 3 decades for them to win the right to vote. And again, of course, African Americans' rights to vote continued to be violated as well until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which has recently been weakened by the Supreme Court decision in 2013 of Shelby v. Holder. So adding these suffrage stories expands the cast of characters involved in suffrage, but it also changes the story itself. We see that these conversations were happening in communities all over the country and even across the world, and that many of women of color had been part of the struggle from the beginning. They fought side by side with their white sisters, and some of those white suffrage leaders were good allies, but often they were deeply disappointing, revealing their feet of clay. So the women I've discussed here today have incredible stories, and I would suggest that they are only the tip of the iceberg, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
I'll start out with a couple, and then of course, everyone, if you have any questions, please ask in the chat, Facebook, please throw your question down in the comment below. It fascinates me that well, all of these women existed, and the story of suffrage and the 19th Amendment is something we hear about. It's even one of those stories that we're taught about in school, yet, of course, none of these women are ever in those books.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned how they're all part of these important communities in different parts of the country. Did they have to actively find each other at these events, at these rallies? I mean, today we have Facebook groups and we have Twitter and we have all these places where we can connect with people we never knew existed. But for people who are this passionate about an issue, and trying to make things happen and sort of joining forces, how would they possibly connect with one another?
That's a great question, right? Yeah, I tell my students, there were pretty incredible ways of communicating, and there's a whole system of the telegraph. People use newspapers a lot like social media, right? Where you'll kind of announce things, even little things like so-and-so had dinner with so-and-so today is in the newspaper. And then the organizations who are sort of organizing these parades would write to, their kind of kindred organizations in those states, right? So there's a huge groundwork, grassroots networking that's happening, and these women are incredible political activists. So what you see is there are the kind of major national organizations, and there are some of these women of color were members of them, so they would have gotten information in their journals or through newsletters. They're also part of their own organizations. So the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs is huge as well. It's for African American women. And again, so they had to be a lot more organized than us, I think, because it took time. But you would publish an announcement, okay, this parade's coming up. We would like to have as many women as possible kind of come to Washington. They would usually say, we'll meet at the YWCA or maybe the Women's Christian Temperance Union, a space, right, where they could meet. And then they would say, be here at this day at this time, and we'll kind of tell you what to do. So on one hand, they have these incredible networks. On the other hand, they also were really organized and kind of knew who to contact in each place, kind of like a phone tree, to get the word out. And they're really successful at it. It's incredible.
Yeah, it is really amazing to me. You talked about, Mabel Lee and Ida B. Wells and Nina Warren, and these are the stories that you're telling us. These women are really, I feel like, taking some serious risks here, right? They're going out of the norm and doing things a little bit differently, probably not all favorable for many. But clearly for them to actually succeed, they have had to have allies, right? People in their corner, had to know someone. Can you talk a little bit about some of those people that may have sort of helped push their efforts forward, people who maybe would have had a greater voice? You talked about Mabel Lee a little bit and her being able to publish. I mean, a PhD for a woman of color, right, at that point in time. So I'm guessing her professors maybe believed in her and try to move some of that forward. And I'm curious a little bit about some of their allies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of them, right, in some cases they do have strong allies, and so that's a good guess. One of her professors is a strong suffragist, and actually, so Columbia College was an all-male school, and Barnard was the sister school, and then Columbia University, which is sorry, my dog's scratching. Columbia University was the grad school. And it allowed women to enroll, but Columbia College didn't. And a lot of the professors at Columbia College refused to teach at Barnard, but some did. And her professor, his wife is a major suffragist. He's the only guy that I've ever gone on Wikipedia to see if he had an article, and he didn't have one, but his wife did. It's the only time I've ever seen that. Now he has one. And so I think he was willing to both teach at Barnard and then to take female grad students, and that was a big deal. But in a lot of cases, they don't get as much, right? They're in some of these spaces and parades, but I don't know how much came back to them all the time. But, in some cases, in the General Federation of Women's Clubs, they get very involved in advocating for Native women. And they hire Gertrude Bonnin. She does a lot of writing and lecturing for them. So yeah, there's sort of some places, and it's usually kind of one or two people who kind of make it happen. And as you say, kind of help them into some place. But I think for a lot of these women, like certainly Ida B. Wells, right, her support is coming from her community, from other African-American women. She's forming organizations in Chicago with African-American women. She's part of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. The NAACP does a lot of work supporting women's suffrage. W.E.B. Du Bois, as the editor of The Crisis, is very supportive and publishes pieces on women's suffrage. And so, the other place that they need allies, right, is from the men in their communities, because other than the American South, where Black men can't vote, certainly in the North, Black men can vote. And so they're part of the group that you need to convince to pass the suffrage legislation.
I'm glad you brought up men. Because, we're the Bruseum. We talk about beer history and culture, and how that relates to the world, past and present. And one question with this particular topic tonight was, what's the deal with suffrage and beer, right? And there are definitely some strong connections. And I'm wondering if you could just, you talked a little bit about that at the beginning, but I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more.
So, there's a bunch of stuff, right? Voting was part of that male drinking culture. Elections, especially early in the 19th, were just like drunken revelries, right? And candidates would actually kind of bring alcohol and sort of be like, vote for me, have a whiskey, or a beer. And so there was this real culture on election day of drinking and carousing, and, polls were often in taverns, and which were not respectable spaces for women. So the culture of voting was really masculine and really around alcohol. And so when the suffragists, when women start asking for the vote, men are threatened by it because it's going to change all of that. And in fact, the suffrage movement is pretty small and limited until Frances Willard and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, when Willard decides that they actually need to be pro-suffrage. Not all women were pro-suffrage, right? But Willard argues that in order to kind of be the change they wanted to see in the world, they needed the vote. They needed the power to actually, they had tried convincing men to pass some of these laws and it wasn't happening. And so she argues that the vote is an important thing for home protection. And once the Women's Christian Temperance Union is the biggest women's organization in the world in the late 19th century. And so once they're on board, the movement really is suddenly much more mainstream, a little more conservative than it had been, but just much bigger, right?
Right.
And so it also sets up, though, really, a real kind of sense that it's a dichotomy between, are you, right? So suffrage gets linked to anti-alcohol. But what's interesting about the women that I write about, at least the ones I know about, not all of them are anti. Some of them are, and in fact, Gertrude Bonnin's really interesting. She's Catholic, as is Nina Otero-Warren, and Nina Otero-Warren was known for liking a good drink, and she had huge parties in Santa Fe. She's kind of a socialite, because Catholics didn't have a problem with alcohol. But Bonnin, what she does, and it's really smart, I think, she's actually against peyote, which was a growing movement. The Native American Church is expanding at this time, and peyote is part of the ceremony, and she was against that. And so she actually allies with the Women's Christian Temperance Union and is arguing that peyote use and alcohol use are the same things. And so she's kind of politically really savvy. So she's trying to make alliances that way. And then I think she hopes that they'll help her with her questions. Yeah.
I wonder what she would say about all the legalization of marijuana right now.
I don't know. And exactly, I don't know. I don't know how a lot of these women would feel about
Right.
it.
In relation to the suffrage movement and prohibition and where they collide, we have a question about if were the fault lines across race and class as women promoted or opposed prohibition?
Oh, that's interesting. So again, there are plenty of women of color who are part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, but I am fairly certain they had segregated, groups. And again, the real clashes often come, right, for women of different religious groups, like especially Catholic women, who are also part of immigrant groups, right? So sometimes those are which is going to be kind of class-based. So if you're kind of working class, poor immigrant Catholic, you're most likely not going to support prohibition. And there are ways in which you might not then support suffrage. But it really kind of depends on who you're talking about and where, I think. Sure. But I would say it's really more about religion and class than race necessarily.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Lucas is mentioning that he's heard about saloons being hotbeds for political conversations of movements, but figured that that's an exclusively male space, which absolutely. Fascinating to hear about women's social organizations, leagues, and clubs. He wonders, though, if the lack of respectable women's presence in saloons still put women at a great disadvantage for communication and networking.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, and I think you saw that even after 1920, right? So much kind of the backroom deals and things happen in places like that. And women did complain that they couldn't go into those spaces, right? But a lot of women, and so there is an interesting moment after 1920 of kind of how are the parties going to change, and are women going to sort of enter into the party? I mean, there's two things. One, a lot of people argued there would be kind of a women's party, that women wouldn't be Democratic or Republican. They were kind of beyond and above that. And so giving women the vote was going to change politics dramatically. They wouldn't be beholden to these parties. That's actually not what happens, right? Otero-Warren is like signing up for the Republican Party as soon as just even before New Mexico actually ratifies. And a lot of women move into the parties, and they don't all go into one or the other, except for African-American women who tend to, at that time, it's Republican. But white women split. And initially the parties are really open to kind of having half women and half men delegates and this sort of thing. But women then run into some of these problems of kind of where are the conversations happening. Once the parties realize that women don't really vote in a block, they become less interested in catering to them. And so, yeah, but they have their own spaces for sure. These clubs are really important. Though they're not serving alcohol. I read lots of descriptions of like cake and ice cream and things like that, but not alcohol.
That we know of, I say.
That we know of, right?
Right. That paper hasn't been found yet. I also I know it's been a while since you have lived in Chicago, but last year, and this was part of the comments in our chat room here, last year, Congress Parkway did get renamed Ida B. Wells Drive. So there's a little bit of giving some of these women the rightful due, but we still have a long way to go. Kathleen, your book.
I just want to jump in and add that was Michelle Duster, who's, I can't remember, I think she's Ida B. Wells' granddaughter, possibly great-granddaughter, and that was a lot of her work. But what's so striking to me is, she's maybe my age, maybe a little bit older, right? And just hits home that wasn't that long ago, right?
Right.
So yeah.
Well, I was reading some of the newspaper clippings in your presentation, and one of the women was in her, I think was it, gosh, I don't remember which one. I think maybe Nina. Was she in her late 40s when she really started kind of going to school and getting?
That was Marie Bottineau Baldwin, she's 42 when she enrolls in law school, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me how all of these women are doing what they can to make a difference. And, Ida B. Wells's granddaughter is also, making the efforts to make sure that we remember who she is, and you're writing books to do that too.
So Liz's question is actually a really good one. I think, and I don't know if you want to quote me on this, but I think that what happens is, prohibition changes drinking culture pretty dramatically. And young women, right, the next generation, see it as really fashionable to get. I mean, all prohibition does is make it, right, cool to drink. And so they're going to the speakeasies, and it becomes a much more, you're absolutely right, much more, both sexes are going to these things, right? Dating culture is also changing. This is a real moment at the turn of the century where the 19th century kind of men hung out with men and women hung out with women. And at the turn of the 20th, it's beginning to change into more, men and women are working together. And then dating culture is changing. And so a lot of couples are going to these speakeasies. And I think some of it is, right, the next generation sort of looks at the suffragists as kind of, that all the stereotypes, right? The Debbie Downers, they don't drink, they don't, and we're young, modern, new women who are doing all of this. So you're right.
I noticed that immediately in the fashion alone. Right? If you look at some of the women in your clippings and you think about that late 19th century Victorian era when women are dressed, all the way up to the neck, down to their ankles and covered. And then all of a sudden, you have the image of the flapper and, she's wearing a shorter dress and, oh my gosh, she's showing her arms. God forbid. So it's amazing to me how you can see that almost that generational difference right at that moment connected to both prohibition and to women's right to vote. Speaking of voting, Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement is a book that you can order now. Kathleen, when do people start getting it? You can order it and it comes out.
So I think it's on the way. I have friends who are posting pictures of it. I don't have it yet, but I know people who do. So I think if you order it, it's highly likely that it will arrive in a few days.
We have it linked on our website. If you go to our events page for this event, you'll find it there. Otherwise, go to your favorite independent bookstore or to the larger online folks who can deliver stuff to your door to get that book. Kathleen, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I really appreciate your time, your expertise. I'm excited to read your book and dig into it and get into the moment with where we're at right now, this election year. Everyone, thank you for joining us and for being part of our virtual happy hour. Please go vote. You make a big difference, and by voting, you honor a lot of these women who did all this work to give us that right. So do your duty as an American citizen, as a woman, if you are one of those, and please go vote. Again, thank you so much, Kathleen.
Guys, this was great fun, and I'm gonna go drink a beer and think.
Yes, we're already ahead of you, but go do that.
All right.
Thanks
Have
again.
a good night. Thanks,
Good night,
Liz.
everybody.